Imagine standing in the middle of an ancient battlefield. The air is thick with dust, the smell of sweat and iron fills your lungs, and somewhere in that chaos, a figure appears shining in bronze armor, eyes fixed not just on the enemy ahead, but on the horizon beyond the fight. This isn't just a soldier. This isn't even just a king. This is a man who has already walked into the pages of history before the ink has dried. This is Alexander the Great. But here's the thing, when we hear the name Alexander the Great, we often picture the marble statue version of him. Flawless, untouchable, almost godlike. We forget that behind that myth was a man with flesh, blood, but something built and eventually undone by choices, habits, and human weakness. And that's where today's story gets interesting. Because this isn't just about military conquests or grand empires. This is about you. It's about the razor's edge every ambitious person walks between greatness and self-destruction. It's about what it really means to be unbeatable, and whether that's something any of us can truly sustain. In this video, we're going to go deep not just into the battles, but into the mind, the discipline, the vision, and yes, the dangerous cracks in the armor of one of history's most fascinating figures. We'll break down the formula that made Alexander seem unstoppable, his courage paired with unshakable discipline, his intellect married to a sweeping vision, and his ability, or sometimes inability, to control himself when it mattered most. And I'm going to challenge you, as you listen to Alexander's story, don't just see it as history, see it as a mirror, because in a world where we're told to conquer our goals, dominate our industries, and never stop hustling, Alexander's life becomes more than an ancient tale. It becomes a cautionary guide for our own. We'll talk about the Alexander who led from the front, taking wounds so his men would never doubt his courage. The Alexander who studied under Aristotle and learned that the sharpest sword is a well-trained mind. The Alexander who envisioned a fusion of cultures that could outlive him by centuries. And we'll also talk about the Alexander who, in a single drunken night, killed his closest friend, proving that no amount of external power can protect you from the enemies inside your own heart. Now, here's where I want you to lean in, because at the end of this story, you're going to face the same question Alexander faced, though maybe not on the same scale. If you had that kind of power, that kind of influence, that kind of almost mythical control over the world around you, could you keep control over yourself? Or would you, like him, find that the hardest enemy to conquer is the one that looks back at you in the mirror? Before we dive in, I need to ask something important, because this channel exists to bring you not just facts, but why it matters for your own life. Then make sure you hit that like button. It takes less than a second, but it tells the YouTube algorithm, hey, this matters. Show it to more people. If you haven't already, tap subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the lessons, triumphs, and tragedies of history's giants. And if you're really enjoying what we're building here, consider supporting the channel through YouTube's Super Thanks feature. It's a way to say, yes, I value this work, and help me keep producing the kind of high-quality, ad-light content you deserve. Because here's the truth, Alexander's story isn't ancient history. It's our story. It's about ambition, leadership, discipline, vision, and the razor-thin line between mastery and self-destruction. By the end of this video, you're not just going to know more about Alexander, you're going to know more about yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you'll have a clearer answer to the question, if I had that much power, could I handle it? So, are you ready? Let's step onto the battlefield, not just of history, but of the human soul. Let's walk beside Alexander the Great, not as a statue or a name in a textbook, but as a man you can understand, admire, and learn from, and maybe even fear. Alexander the Great stands in history like a figure carved out of myth, his image bathed in the kind of light we usually reserve for gods or legends. To his soldiers, he was not merely a commander. They often believed, in all seriousness, that he might truly be divine. And in the minds of those who opposed him, his name carried the weight of inevitability, as if resistance itself was a temporary delay before surrender. This perception wasn't the product of years and decades. it happened astonishingly fast. In just over a decade, Alexander went from a youthful successor of a Macedonian king to the most feared and respected man alive. His name was known in every city, in every court, in every corner of the known world. In an era where news traveled on horseback and on the lips of traders, his reputation traveled faster than armies. And what traveled with it was not just the report of his victories, but a sense of awe, like something larger than life had stepped into human history. When we think about how someone acquires that kind of aura, we tend to imagine a blend of charisma, military genius, and an almost unreasonable confidence. But with Alexander, the mixture was more potent. He carried himself as though the world was already his, and he moved with the assurance of someone convinced that the gods themselves were co-authors of his destiny. This conviction wasn't just an internal belief, it radiated outward, shaping the way his men fought for him and the way his enemies feared him. There's a powerful lesson here. People will often mirror the belief you project. If you believe you cannot be beaten, leading charges, taking wounds, and enduring the same hardships as his troops. In fact, he was wounded 9 times in his life, each scar becoming part of the living legend. It's one thing to be a leader who orders men into danger. It's another to be the leader who stands shoulder to shoulder with them in that danger. This is one of the reasons his soldiers followed him with such fierce loyalty. They didn't just obey Alexander, they believed in him. The fear he inspired in his enemies was equally real. To them, Alexander was not a man you could negotiate into compromise. He was an unstoppable force. Once his army was moving toward you, the question wasn't whether he would arrive. And yet it was never just about conquest for its own sake, at least not on the surface. Alexander's vision stretched beyond military dominance. He wanted a world knit together under his rule, a fusion of cultures and ideas that would outlast him. This is why, in the places he conquered, he often installed not just soldiers, but architects, scholars, and administrators, leaving behind more than just ruins. But the question remains, what truly made him unbeatable? Was it his instinct, honed from years of observation and training under some of the finest minds of his era? Was it his intellect, sharpened by the personal mentorship of Aristotle, who taught him philosophy, politics, and the art of critical thought? Or was it something else entirely, a kind of unshakable faith in his own destiny that allowed him to take risks others would shy away from? In truth, it was all of these things at once. Alexander combined an almost reckless bravery with disciplined strategy. He could read the battlefield like a chess master sees the board. Certain figures, athletes, entrepreneurs, political leaders seemed to command attention the way Alexander did. Michael Jordan in the 1990s didn't just play basketball. He redefined what was possible on the court, and opponents often spoke about him with the same mix of respect and resignation that Alexander's enemies might have felt. Steve Jobs didn't just run a company. He convinced the world to believe in a vision of technology that didn't yet exist, bending industries to his will. These modern parallels remind us that the traits Alexander displayed, vision, confidence, the ability to inspire, and the willingness to lead from the front, are timeless in their impact. Still, there's a darker undercurrent to this kind of power. The same unwavering confidence that propels someone forward can also blind them to their own vulnerabilities. Alexander's belief in his semi-divine nature, while inspiring to his troops, also meant he often discounted the possibility of failure or death. That worked in his favor on the battlefield. Fear was simply not part of his calculation, but it also meant that his personal life and political relationships could suffer. But on the stories that surrounded him. In the ancient world, storytelling was the social media of the time. Merchants would carry tales of his bravery across trade routes, because they had to explain how such a young man could topple empires. Over time, the line between fact and legend blurred, and that worked entirely in his favor. In the same way that celebrities today are often larger than life because of the stories told about them, Alexander's image was amplified by the narrative. Ultimately, he cultivated an aura that made people believe resistance was futile. In human psychology, perception can be as decisive as fact. Armies are made of human beings. Even more than 2,000 years later, we still talk about him not just as a historical figure, but as a standard of greatness. His life prompts the same question it did in his own time. Was his success the product of rare human qualities, or did he tap into something beyond the human? Perhaps the answer is that he blurred that boundary so convincingly that it no longer mattered. To his soldiers, he was a god in human form. To his enemies, he was an unstoppable force. And to history, he remained a reminder that sometimes the belief in invincibility is the most powerful weapon of all. Alexander the Great's defining trait was not simply that he wanted to win, but that he wanted to win beyond any conceivable measure. He wasn't the kind of leader who measured success by a single great battle or a secure border. For him, the idea of enough didn't exist. Each conquest was not an endpoint, but a doorway to the next. This is why, even after securing victories that would have satisfied any other ruler in history, Alexander would look toward the horizon with the same hunger in his eyes. The known world was not enough. He wanted the unknown as well. It's tempting to romanticize this as the purest form of vision, but it was also deeply dangerous because when ambition has no boundary, neither does risk. He was bold to the point of recklessness, but his recklessness was calculated, if that paradox can exist. He would take chances that would terrify most commanders. Yet they often paid off because his mind could see the battlefield several moves ahead. Still, there's a thin line between bravery and the kind of gamble that could cost everything. In Alexander's case, his courage inspired his men because they could see that he was never asking them to do something he wouldn't do himself. But it also meant that his empire was tethered to the will and vitality of one man. When that man is unyielding and tireless, it works. When that man stumbles, everything can unravel. From a personal perspective, ambition like Alexander's is a double-edged sword. On one side, it's the purest fuel for achievement. It pushes you through exhaustion, through discomfort, through fear. It refuses to let you settle for mediocrity or even for greatness. You're always reaching for something just out of grasp. This is why the world remembers the people who have it. Not just Alexander, but others across time who refuse to stop pushing forward. Think of Elon Musk, who, regardless of opinion about him, embodies a similar refusal to be confined to a single goal. Electric cars weren't enough, he wanted to colonize Mars. Or think of Michael Jordan, for whom winning a championship was not the culmination, but the expectation, and who trained like a man who had never won anything in his life. These are modern echoes of the same restless drive Alexander lived by. But on the other side, ambition without boundaries can become something darker, an obsession that blinds you to the costs. When your identity is wrapped entirely in achieving the next big thing, you risk losing sight of what you've already accomplished, and you risk ignoring the damage you might cause in pursuit of more. For Alexander, this meant leading his men deeper and deeper into foreign lands, often into conditions so brutal that even his most loyal troops began to question whether the goal was still worth it. In his mind, ambition is like fire. It can cook your food or burn down your house. Used well, it's a compass pointing you toward your highest potential. Used poorly, it's a chain, binding you to an endless cycle of chasing something you can never catch. The difference lies in control, in knowing when to direct that energy and when to let it rest. Alexander's life shows us both sides. In the early years, his ambition was guided by strategy, discipline, and an understanding of timing. There's a point where the will to win overrides common sense. In Alexander's case, it wasn't a torn ligament or a strained muscle. It was the health of an entire army and the stability of an empire. Yet to him, the greater risk was in slowing down. This mindset is intoxicating to those who follow such a leader because it suggests that nothing is impossible. But it's also exhausting. He didn't see himself merely as a king. He saw himself as a figure chosen by the gods to reshape the world. That belief gave him the kind of confidence most people can't even imagine. The startup that raises one round of funding immediately chases the next. The athlete who wins a championship immediately talks about repeating. The student who graduates with honors immediately looks for the next credential. There's value in pushing forward, but there's also wisdom in knowing when to consolidate, to reflect, and to stabilize before launching the next campaign. Alexander rarely paused long enough to do that. He was always on the move, always looking past the horizon. And while that gave him unmatched momentum, it also meant that he never fully secured the peace that might have made his empire last beyond his lifetime. The lesson, then, is not that ambition is dangerous or that we should avoid it, but that ambition must be directed. It should serve as a guide, not a master. If it's your guide, you can channel it into goals that build on each other, creating a legacy that endures. If it's your master, you may achieve incredible things, but you'll always feel an itch that no victory can scratch. Alexander's life, in all its brilliance and tragedy, is a reminder of this truth. The world will remember you for the heights you reach, but you will live your life in the space between those heights, and if that space is filled only with a need for more, you may find that the victory you were chasing was never really there at all. When Alexander was 13, his father, King Philip II of Macedon, made a decision that would shape not only his son's destiny, but the fate of the ancient world. He brought in Aristotle, one of the greatest minds in history, to serve as Alexander's personal tutor. This wasn't just a matter of finding a good teacher, it was a deliberate move to prepare a future ruler with the intellectual weapons to match his military inheritance. Philip understood something that many leaders, ancient and modern, overlook. Raw power can win battles, but it is knowledge that sustains empires. And Aristotle's role was not to teach Alexander what to think, but how to think. This is a subtle but crucial difference, and it's what made their relationship so transformative. They studied in Mysa, a quiet village, so that Alexander could focus entirely on his intellectual development. Aristotle didn't lecture him into submission, he challenged him, encouraged him to question, and insisted on observation as the foundation of knowledge. For example, when studying politics, Aristotle would have Alexander consider not only the laws of Macedonia, but also the systems of other Greek city-states, the customs of Persia, and even the philosophies of distant lands. One of Aristotle's greatest contributions was teaching Alexander critical thinking. In a world where kings were often surrounded by flatterers and yes-men, the ability to analyze situations objectively was a form of armor. Aristotle taught him to weigh evidence, to anticipate consequences, and to understand human motivations. This is why Alexander was able to adapt so fluidly in battle and in governance. He wasn't tied to a single rigid doctrine. If a plan failed, he didn't cling to it out of pride. He rethought it, adjusted it, and moved forward. In modern terms, this is the equivalent of a CEO pivoting their entire business model when market conditions change, rather than going down with a failing strategy. Leaders who lack this mental flexibility often burn out or lose relevance quickly, while those who cultivate it, as Alexander did, can sustain influence for years. Another equally important lesson from Aristotle was emotional control. For a young man destined to command armies and rule over vast territories, the ability to master one's emotions could be the difference between stability and chaos. Aristotle emphasized moderation, the golden mean, where virtues like courage avoid tipping into recklessness, and ambition avoids turning into greed. Alexander absorbed these lessons, at least for much of his life. Emotional discipline allowed him to inspire not just fear, but respect, a far more durable form of authority. This is where we can start to see why knowledge is a more enduring weapon than military might. Armies can be destroyed, cities can fall, but a vision rooted in understanding can survive long after the banners are gone. Rather than ruling conquered territories solely through Macedonian officials, Alexander often incorporated local customs, respected local religions, and even adopted certain Persian court practices. This cultural blending laid the groundwork for the Hellenistic era, a period when Greek language, art, and thought spread across the Near East, influencing everything from architecture to philosophy. Without his education, Alexander might have ruled like any other conqueror, imposing his culture at the expense of others. Instead, he created something more enduring, a cultural synthesis that outlived his empire. It's easy to see the parallel in our own time. In business, in politics, and even in personal life, these are modern versions of the same principle Aristotle gave to Alexander. The broader your understanding, the more resilient your leadership. And this is why continuous education is essential for any leader today. The world changes too fast to rely solely on the knowledge you gained at the start of your career. Alexander's education didn't end when he left Mysa. He carried books with him on his campaigns, including a personal copy of Homer's Iliad annotated by Aristotle himself. Even in the midst of war, he read and studied, refining his ideas. This habit of learning in motion is something modern leaders could benefit from. Too often, people reach a certain level of success and stop actively developing themselves. They may still gather information, but they no longer challenge their own assumptions. Alexander's example suggests that the most powerful leaders never stop being students, because the moment you think you have nothing left to learn, you're already on the decline. Of course, understanding politics as more than just a game of power allowed Alexander to keep his empire relatively stable during rapid expansion. He could negotiate with hostile rulers, build alliances through marriage, and address unrest not only with force, but with policy changes. In today's terms, and strategic vision are tools that can be applied in everyday life. Critical thinking helps you navigate misinformation and make sound decisions. Emotional control allows you to handle stress without making impulsive mistakes. Strategic vision enables you to plan for the long term while adapting to change. These aren't abstract virtues, they're practical survival skills in any field. Looking back, it's striking how much of Alexander's success can be traced to his formative education. Without Aristotle's influence, he might still have been a formidable warrior after all. His father had already built a strong army, but he would not have been the kind of leader who could unify such diverse peoples under a single banner. He would not have had the intellectual framework to see beyond immediate victories to the possibility of a blended cultural world. That's why, even with all his military glory, the most valuable inheritance Alexander left to history wasn't the borders he drew on the map, but the ideas he spread across them. His empire eventually fractured after his death, but the cultural and intellectual currents he set in motion continued to flow for centuries. In a way, this is the ultimate proof of the principle that knowledge is the most enduring weapon. The phalanxes are gone. The cities have been rebuilt or renamed, but the exchange of ideas between East and West that Alexander championed still echoes in the art, philosophy, and science of our own age. It's a reminder that while power can force change, only understanding can make it last. And that, more than any battle he fought, is what makes Alexander's story a lesson worth studying today. Alexander had an extraordinary way of making his presence felt where it mattered most on the front lines. For him, leadership wasn't something that could be exercised entirely from the safety of a tent far from the chaos of battle. Throughout his campaigns, he placed himself in the thick of the action. He marched under the same blistering sun, endured the same bitter cold, crossed the same rivers, and often ate the same rations as his soldiers. In doing so, he erased the invisible wall that usually separates leaders from those they lead, and in its place, he built an unshakable bond of loyalty. Alexander's leadership thrived on that difference. His men knew he would never demand of them something he wasn't willing to face himself. And in the ancient world, where battle was fought hand to hand and leaders were expected to be visible symbols of courage, this mattered immensely. Soldiers drew strength from seeing their king in the dust and blood beside them, not as an untouchable figure on a hill, but as a living example of what he expected from them. One of the clearest illustrations of this came during the siege of the Malian city in India. The attack was fierce, and Alexander, as always, was at the front. In a moment of impulsive bravery or reckless disregard for his own safety, he scaled the city walls ahead of his men and leapt into the enemy's stronghold. Surrounded and outnumbered, he fought with his usual ferocity, but was struck by an arrow that pierced his lung. The wound was severe, breathing was agony, and he was on the verge of collapse. His soldiers, seeing their king in such danger, surged forward in a desperate push to reach him, fighting harder than they might have under any other circumstance. When they finally broke through and carried him to safety, it was not the act of saving their commander that fueled their relief. It was the knowledge that they were fighting for a man who had already given everything he had to stand with them. Even after sustaining such injuries, Alexander refused to let weakness define him. When word spread through the camp that he might not survive, morale began to sink. So, in an act as symbolic as it was defiant, Alexander had himself carried out before the troops so they could see him alive. He stood there, pale and visibly wounded but upright. He spoke to them, assuring them that he would recover and that their mission was not finished. In that moment, he turned what could have been a devastating blow to morale into a rallying point. His soldiers saw not just their leader, but a man who embodied the very ideals he demanded from them: endurance, courage, and the will to keep moving forward no matter the cost. From a philosophical perspective, this style of leadership underscores a timeless truth. Authority is not just about giving direction, it's about shared sacrifice. Leaders who isolate themselves from the struggles of their people may maintain control, but they rarely inspire devotion. Alexander's presence in battle was a form of communication more powerful than any speech. It told his men that they were not pawns to be moved on a chessboard. They were comrades in a shared endeavor. Employees respond more strongly to leaders who are willing to be in the trenches, figuratively speaking, when challenges arise. A CEO who works late alongside their team during a critical product launch sends a message that goes beyond any memo about shared goals. In sports, the mechanics of war and peace may have changed, but the human response to visible commitment has not. What made Alexander's frontline leadership even more remarkable was that it wasn't for show. In politics or warfare, some leaders make symbolic gestures of involvement without ever truly engaging in the hardship. Alexander didn't just make an appearance at the front before retreating to safety. He fought there, bled there, and sometimes nearly died there. And Alexander paid for his approach with his own body. By the end of his campaigns, he bore multiple scars from wounds sustained in battle. But those scars were also a form of currency, proof that he had earned his place among them, proof that his commands were backed by personal courage. The idea that example is more persuasive than instruction. People may hear what you say, but they believe what you do. Alexander could have lectured his men about bravery and endurance until his voice gave out, and it still wouldn't have had the impact of seeing him charge into danger first. That single act collapses any distance between leader and follower, turning orders into shared commitments. This is why, even in moments when victory seemed impossible, his army would push through fatigue and fear. They were following a man who had already proven that he would go further than anyone else. In the long arc of history, leaders who embody this kind of integrity tend to outlast those who rule through fear alone. Fear can motivate in the short term, but it erodes trust over time. Respect, once earned through consistent action, creates a foundation that can endure hardship and setbacks. Alexander's career is a case study in how respect built on example can unify people from vastly different backgrounds and keep them moving toward a common goal, even when the odds are against them. His approach also challenges a common misconception about leadership, that it requires detachment. The prevailing belief in some circles is that leaders must remain above the fray to maintain objectivity. Alexander's life suggests a different model. You can be deeply embedded in the struggle without losing your ability to make clear decisions. In fact, that embeddedness can give you a better understanding of the stakes and the morale of your people. It's the difference between managing a crisis from a distant office and walking the factory floor to see the problem firsthand. The siege where Alexander was gravely wounded has been retold countless times because it captures the essence of who he was as a leader. In that moment, he wasn't a distant king orchestrating moves from behind the lines. He was the heartbeat of the fight, the living embodiment of the courage he demanded. In that image, we are more willing to follow someone who is willing to walk into the fire with us. If you strip away the historical details, the principle remains simple and enduring. Leadership that inspires is leadership that participates. Whether it's an ancient battlefield, a modern boardroom, a sports arena, or a humanitarian mission, the people who follow you will measure your commitment by your presence in their struggle. Alexander understood that better than most, and it's one of the reasons his name still carries the weight of greatness. He didn't just tell his men where to go, he went there first. And in doing so, he turned himself from a ruler into a legend. The story of Alexander killing Clitus is one of those moments in history that's so jarring it forces you to see a legendary figure in a painfully human light. Clitus the Black wasn't just another officer in Alexander's army. He was a trusted friend and a proven hero who had saved Alexander's life in battle. Years earlier, during the Battle of Granicus, Clitus had cut down an enemy soldier who was about to strike Alexander from behind. That single act might have been the difference between Alexander's name being a footnote in history and his name becoming immortal. And yet, in a haze of alcohol and rage, Alexander ended that life with his own hand. It's an event that historians still wrestle with, not just for what it says about Alexander's character, but for what it reveals about the corrosive effects of power and excess. The immediate context was a banquet, one of many where heavy drinking was the norm. Alexander had already developed a taste for undiluted wine, something the Greeks and Macedonians typically considered excessive. At this particular gathering, tensions flared. Accounts vary, but most versions agree that a heated argument broke out, fueled by pride, differing opinions about Alexander's policies, and the disinhibiting effects of alcohol. Clitus, outspoken and unwilling to flatter the king when he disagreed, criticized Alexander's embrace of Persian customs and perhaps his treatment of Macedonian veterans. Especially when combined with unchecked authority, it can lower inhibitions, exaggerate emotions, and dull the capacity for self-reflection. For someone in Alexander's position, surrounded by people who rarely challenged him, that combination could be lethal. In that state, a ruler doesn't just lose his temper. He loses his entire framework for considering consequences. That night, Alexander's pride, already inflamed, found no restraint. He lashed out, grabbed a weapon, and struck Clitus down before those present could intervene. But the fuel had been building for years. By this stage in his career, Alexander was not just a king, he was the most powerful man in the known world. His word was law, his victories unparalleled, and his reputation almost godlike. Absolute power has a way of altering perception. It can make criticism feel like treachery, dissent like rebellion. In a moment of intoxicated rage, commit an act that would haunt it forever. This is where the deeper lesson emerges. The greatest threat to a powerful person is not an external enemy, but the weaknesses they carry within. Alexander could outthink rival generals, outmaneuver hostile armies, and survive wounds that would kill most men. But when it came to mastering his own impulses under the influence of drink and pride, he failed. That's not a unique flaw to him. History is filled with leaders, athletes, business moguls, and artists who conquered external challenges only to be undone by internal ones. Think of modern figures who built empires, whether in politics or entertainment, only to see them crumble because of addiction, ego, or unchecked emotion. The enemy inside is often invisible until it's too late, and by then, the damage is irreversible. One of the cruel ironies is that Alexander reportedly fell into deep regret after killing Clitus. Some sources suggest he was inconsolable, locking himself away and refusing food for days. This is the other side of unrestrained power. Once the act is done, you can't undo it, and the weight of it can crush even the strongest. That is a ghost that would follow anyone, no matter how vast their empire. The dynamics here also point to something we see in leadership at every level. When no one can tell you no, your worst impulses have free rein. Alexander's entourage was full of capable men, but most were conditioned to defer to him. This is why the modern concept of having people who will tell you the truth is so vital in leadership. Whether you're running a company or commanding an army, surrounding yourself with only those who agree with you is an invitation to disaster. The role of alcohol in this story is also worth unpacking. For Alexander, drinking wasn't just a social pastime, it was a cultural and personal habit that grew into something harmful. In moderation, shared drinking can be a way to build camaraderie, as it was in many ancient societies. But when it becomes a constant, especially for someone in command, it can erode the very qualities that make leadership effective: clarity, patience, and the ability to weigh long-term consequences over short-term emotion. It's the same in modern contexts. How many promising careers have been derailed not by incompetence or lack of skill, but by the inability to control a destructive habit? The tragedy of Alexander and Clytus serves as a vivid warning that greatness and downfall can come from the same source. The drive, confidence, and dominance that made Alexander unstoppable in battle also made him vulnerable in moments of personal conflict. The same pride that led him to stand at the front lines made it unbearable for him to be challenged in public. And the same passion that fueled his ambition became uncontrollable when inflamed by drink. This duality exists in many high achievers. The very traits that elevate them can also be the seeds of their undoing if left unchecked. On a personal level, this is a reminder that self-mastery is the highest form of strength. You can't always control what others do, but you can control how you respond, and the training to avoid that night's outcome. But the fatal mix of pride and impairment overwhelmed all of them. In the end, the image of Alexander as an invincible conqueror is incomplete without acknowledging moments like this. His empire stretched across continents. His name echoed in every corner of the ancient world. But none of that could shield him from a lapse of judgment in a private room. The lesson is as relevant now as it was then. Conquering the world is meaningless if you cannot first conquer yourself. Alexander's so-called formula for being unbeatable comes down to three interlocking qualities that fed each other in a constant loop. The first was courage paired with discipline. Courage on its own can be reckless. Discipline on its own can be rigid. Together, they created a leader who not only stepped into danger, but did so with precision. Courage fizzles out in a burst of adrenaline. Without courage, discipline becomes an endless drill with no victory. The second element was intellect fused with vision. Alexander was not just a master tactician who could outmaneuver enemies on the battlefield. He was a strategist in the grand sense. His mind was trained to see beyond the immediate win toward what that win could mean in a year, in a decade, in a lifetime. This is why he didn't just conquer lands, he reshaped cultures, merging Greek and Eastern traditions into something entirely new. The vision went beyond flags planted in the ground. It was about building something that could last beyond his own life. Leaders in any era who combine intellect with vision can create seismic change, whether that's Steve Jobs transforming consumer technology by imagining products no one asked for yet, or Nelson Mandela steering an entire nation toward reconciliation instead of vengeance. Intellect without vision is just analysis. Vision without intellect is just fantasy. Alexander had both. And that combination allowed him to imagine possibilities others couldn't even see. The third, and perhaps the most fragile, was self-control. This was the one quality that, when it held, kept the other two in balance, and when it slipped, threatened to bring the whole structure down. Self-control is the ability to master your impulses, your pride, your fears, and your desires. It's knowing when to hold your tongue, when to step back, and when to act, not because you've been forced into restraint, but because you've chosen it. For Alexander, and staying focused on his larger vision, even when surrounded by temptations to indulge his ego. But self-control was also where he faltered most painfully in the drunken killing of Clitus, which shows how even the most powerful leaders can be undone by lapses in their own discipline. It's the same weakness that has brought down CEOs, politicians, and generals in our own time. The higher you climb, the more essential self-control becomes, because every slip is amplified. Vision without discipline becomes wishful thinking. Alexander's most brilliant years were when all three qualities were aligned, each reinforcing the others. That alignment is what made him seem unbeatable. But the illusion of being unbeatable is just that, an illusion. Time, circumstance, and human frailty eventually catch up to everyone. Let his pride and temper destroy a friendship and stain his own legacy. The deeper truth is that strength isn't about never being defeated. It's about sustaining the balance that lets you push forward without destroying yourself or the people who follow you. That balance is harder to maintain the more success you have, because each victory can feed a sense of invulnerability. You start to believe your own myth, and when that happens, you stop listening, you stop questioning yourself, and you stop guarding against the dangers inside you. If you look at the arc of Alexander's life, you see that his unbeatable status wasn't permanent. It was a fragile state maintained by a rare balance of courage, intellect, and control. It's a reminder that being unbeatable isn't about some supernatural gift. It's about a set of human qualities that anyone can develop, but few can sustain. And sustaining them is the real test, because the longer you hold power, the harder it is to keep those qualities intact. So the question isn't just how to become unbeatable, but how to stay that way without losing yourself in the process. And that leads to the question that lingers after studying Alexander's life. If you had the kind of power he wielded, power over armies, find that the hardest battle is the one against your own nature. And there you have it, the rise, the triumphs, and the cracks in the armor of a man the world still calls the great, more than 2,000 years later. We've seen Alexander in his full dimensions, the fearless commander leading from the front, the brilliant strategist shaped by Aristotle's teachings, the visionary who dreamed of blending East and West into something entirely new, and the flawed human being who, in a single drunken moment, destroyed a bond that no battlefield could break. If there's one thing to take away from his story, it's that unbeatable isn't a permanent state, it's a balance. They can make you blind to the warning signs. Alexander's life proves that the same fire that drives us to greatness can also burn us down if we let it. And that's where this becomes more than history, because every one of us, in our own way, faces the same choices. You might not command armies, but you have influence in your work, in your family, in your community. You might not be leading charges in fortified cities, but you are fighting battles every day against fear, against complacency, against the temptation to take the easy path instead of the right one. And if you're ambitious, if you're driven, then you know that success can be its own kind of battlefield. The higher you climb, the more important it becomes to keep your footing. So ask yourself honestly, if you had Alexander's reach, his resources, his almost mythical status, could you keep your balance? Could you hold onto the very qualities that got you there in the first place? Or would you, like so many before and after him, find that the real war isn't out there, it's inside you? I hope this story doesn't just leave you impressed by Alexander's accomplishments, but also mindful of the lessons his failures teach. History isn't just a record of what happened, it's a mirror, showing us what we might become, for better or worse. If we're wise, we learn not only from the victories, but from the missteps that even the greatest among us can make. To think deeply, and to carry these lessons into your own life. If this resonated with you, please take a moment to like the video. It's the simplest way to tell YouTube that this kind of thoughtful storytelling matters. If you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here for our next deep dive. I promise you, we've got more stories coming, some from history, some from philosophy, and some from unexpected places that will challenge the way you see leadership, power, and yourself. And if you feel moved to help keep this channel thriving, consider clicking that super thanks button below. Your support directly fuels the research, writing, and production that go into making each of these videos something worth your time. Alexander's life is proof that power tests character as much as it rewards skill. It's proof that greatness isn't just about what you can take from the world, it's about what you can build, and whether it lasts after you're gone. And it's proof that no matter how high you climb, you are never beyond the reach of your own flaws. So I'll leave you with the question we began with, the one that lingers long after the last battle is fought. If you had the power of Alexander the Great, would you keep control of yourself, or would you lose the very thing that made you great in the first place? Think about it.